Russia's military, once hailed as one of the most powerful in the world, is now falling apart. Putin believed he could swiftly conquer Ukraine, but instead he's faced with a military in disarray, collapsing bit by bit. So, what happened to this so-called military giant? From untrained conscripts thrown into battle to outdated tanks from the 1960s being destroyed by $200 drones, it's evident that Russia's dominance is nothing more than a myth. Putin's increasing desperation only worsens the situation. What was once a formidable military now resembles a rusting relic struggling to survive. In this breakdown, we explore how Russia's once feared military is embarrassingly falling apart on the global stage. From manpower shortages and obsolete equipment to tanks being decimated by Ukrainian forces, it's a catastrophe Putin can't escape. Let's examine how his vision of Russian supremacy has turned into a global joke. First, let's address Russia's conscription and population challenges, which reveal how far behind the country is militarily. Despite claims of power, Global Firepower ranks Russia's military as the second most powerful in early 2024, with approximately 1.3 million active personnel across various branches, including the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard. For context, this puts Russia in a similar position to the US and behind China and India, which each have around 1.45 to 2 million active service members. On paper, Russia appears to be highly militarized. However, when considering the total population, Russia's numbers look less impressive. China and India have populations of over 1.4 billion, while the US has around 330 million. Russia, on the other hand, has just 140 million people, based on pre-war census figures. The country's heavy militarization is largely due to aggressive conscription and recruitment tactics. To attract soldiers, Russia has been offering substantial salaries, often 3 to 4 times the national average. In 2023 alone, around 49,000 contracts were signed, according to Riddle, a publication that analyzes Russian affairs. By comparison, the US typically enlists about 150,000 recruits for basic training each year. However, despite the high recruitment numbers, Russia faces a massive conscription problem that is only getting worse. Every 6 months, the Russian government drafts around 150,000 conscripts, many of whom have little to no training before being sent to the front lines. This forced recruitment scheme has raised serious concerns about the quality of soldiers being added to the ranks. Instead of a well-trained, professional army, Russia is sending out waves of underprepared and under-equipped recruits to face Ukraine's well-organized forces. The problem doesn't end there. Russia's casualty rate is staggering. Over the first 32 months of the war, estimates suggest that more than 660,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded. On average, Russia is losing between 1,000 to 1,200 soldiers a day. At this rate, they could lose over 1 million soldiers by early 2025. And yet, instead of scaling back, they continue to draft more and more bodies into the war effort, throwing them into a conflict with little hope of success. As a result, experienced soldiers are being replaced by green recruits with minimal training. Many of these conscripts are legally barred from being deployed abroad, which means Russia is forced to rely on a shrinking pool of experienced combatants while throwing inexperienced soldiers into the front lines. This has led to a dangerous imbalance where veteran troops, once considered the backbone of the military, are being replaced by a steady stream of poorly trained, often unwilling fighters. Next, let's talk about the state of Russia's military equipment, which is just as bad, if not worse. Russia may claim to have around 14,000 tanks, but the reality is far bleaker. Over 9,000 of these tanks have been destroyed in combat, leaving the Russian forces with little more than outdated models from the 1960s like the T-62 and T-54. These tanks are incredibly vulnerable, not only due to their age but also because of their poor design. They are easy targets for modern weapons, including drones. In fact, Russian tanks have become prime targets for cheap, mass-produced drones that are capable of devastating them in mere seconds. Even worse, Russia's ability to replace these tanks is quickly fading. With their military production capacity struggling under the weight of sanctions and logistical difficulties, it's feared that Russia could run out of tanks within the next 2 years. Meanwhile, Ukraine has been rapidly improving its defense capabilities, including the development of more advanced anti-tank technologies, making it even harder for Russia to keep up. The situation isn't much better when it comes to mechanized infantry vehicles. Russia started the war with a fleet of about 4,000 BMPs, but as the conflict has dragged on, roughly half of them have been destroyed. This is a huge blow to their ground forces, especially considering how easily these vehicles have been outperformed by US-made Bradley fighting vehicles, which have been given to Ukraine in growing numbers. Artillery, which has traditionally been a strength for Russia, is still a potent force on the battlefield. The Russians managed to produce around 3 million shells per year, but even this advantage is being tested. Russia's air force, once feared for its strength, is also facing serious challenges. Ukraine's successful deployment of Patriot anti-air defense systems has severely limited Russia's air superiority, while the wear and tear on their aging aircraft is becoming increasingly apparent. Add to this the potential loss of Russian aircraft in dogfights and ground attacks, and Russia's air power is starting to look more like a liability than a strength. But the real kicker is Russia's economic situation. The sanctions imposed by the West have hammered the Russian economy, making it difficult for them to keep their military supplied with essential equipment and fuel. To cope, Russia has turned to China and Iran for support, relying on them for everything from weapons to oil. But these partnerships have their own risks. Trade with China is strained, and while Iran's support is valuable, it's far from sufficient to replace the loss of Western technology and imports. Moreover, Russia's oil and gas exports vital for funding the war have been severely impacted by Western sanctions and targeted strikes on refineries, further limiting Moscow's ability to sustain the war effort. So where does all of this leave Russia? The country, once thought to be a military giant, is now stumbling on multiple fronts. The conscription system is overwhelmed, the troops are poorly trained, the equipment is outdated or destroyed, and the economy is buckling under the weight of sanctions. Putin's once proud military is now a shadow of its former self, and it's clear that Russia is paying a far higher price for this war than anyone could have predicted. This situation not only highlights the failure of Putin's military strategy, but also shows how the international community has adapted to Russia's aggression. As the war continues, the gap between Russia's military capabilities and those of its adversaries only grows wider, and the Russian people are left to suffer the consequences of a conflict that shows no signs of ending soon. So, as the reality of Russia's military power continues to unravel, the world watches, wondering if Putin's dream of a Russian resurgence will ever be realized, or if his once mighty military will collapse entirely under the pressure of its own failures. One thing is clear: the war in Ukraine is far from over, and Russia is in for a long, hard road ahead.